Okay, we're at 1 or so minutes past the hour, so I'm going to go ahead and get us started. Thank you very much for joining us. My name is Amanda Graham. I am the academic director at the Arthur Irving Institute for Energy and Society at Dartmouth College. And we have been having a wonderful time this past year hosting this new energy speaker series. The series is designed to give a platform for young scholars in the energy space to share their work, to get feedback and wrangle with questions. And it's a great way for all of us who are observing and listening to these to really learn about what's on the cutting edge, the emerging edge of energy and society research. And so today I am really delighted to welcome Deidra Miniard to our group of new energy speakers. Deidra is a PhD student at Indiana University. She's in the O'Neill School of Public and Environmental Affairs, and she is in Shazeen Attari's lab there. And we have hosted a number of folks from that lab over the course of this past year for wonderful conversations. And what Deidra is going to focus on today is her work on a shared vision for a decarbonized energy future. And I'm looking forward to hearing more about how we share our vision, what you're thinking about in terms of what energy futures might look like. And we will learn more in just a moment. And I do want to let folks know that as you're listening to Deidra's talk, please feel free if you have questions to load them up in the Q&A. And so after about 30 minutes or so, we will turn over to questions and discussion. So we'll be ready for the questions that you throw into the Q&A anytime. And with that, Deidra, please take it away. Thank you for being here.
No, great. Thank you for having me and that great introduction. All right. Share screen. All right, I'm assuming everyone can see it.
Looks good.
Fantastic. So I'm Deidra Miniard, a PhD student at Indiana University. Today I'm going to be talking about the work of two studies that I've done looking at people's vision for a future energy system and kind of the motivating factors driving the energy future they want. And so I'll start with some acknowledgements. I'll acknowledge both of my co-authors on some of this work. So Dr. Shazeen Attari at Indiana University and Dr. Joseph Kantenbacher at the University of South Dakota, as well as fellow students who helped with the work, Anaga Gore, as well as all of our funding sources. And to provide a brief outline of how this talk will go, so I'm going to start with a study looking at national energy mix perceptions, and then move into a qualitative study looking at state energy mix perceptions. And then I'll discuss the implication of these findings together at the end. So starting with the national energy mix, to provide some background, one of the challenges we face is that the United States needs to decarbonize the energy system pretty rapidly in order to address climate change. But we find that action can be quite challenging, and there's multiple reasons for this. Climate change can at times be a distant phenomenon, so it's happening, the worst impacts are happening in the future to other people. In a recent work from the Yale Climate Group, they found that less than half of the people in the US think it's harming people right now. And it may not be the most salient issue to people, right? When Gallup releases a poll quite frequently asking people the most important problem facing the US, and the environment and climate change kind of hovers around 3%. It's also increasingly divisive, right, across ideological and party lines. So this is also work from the Yale Climate Group. And what we see is that there's this division between liberals and liberal Democrats and conservatives and Republicans as to the priority we should place on climate change action. And we're seeing that there's an increase for Democrats, but for Republicans, it's either decreasing or staying pretty stagnant. But transitioning to low carbon sources may not be as fraught with political divisiveness. We see that renewable energy sources tend to be viewed more favorably than fossil fuels, even by conservatives and Republicans. So taking this together, this research asks, what are people's perceptions of our current energy system? What do they hope that energy system will look like in 30 years? And then what is their level of support or opposition to the energy policies that could get us to that desired energy future? And so I'll talk about our methodology for this study. So we surveyed roughly 2,500 adults in the United States online through Amazon's Mechanical Turk. Now, MTurk is an online platform where workers sign up to be paid for tasks. They were paid to take a survey. And to give a sense of what the sample looked like, it did skew liberal and educated, with a mean age of around 38 years and an income slightly higher than the national average. But we did have roughly an even split on gender. As far as what the survey looks like, participants were given a table that looks much like the one on your screen, and they were asked about the energy mix. So when we talk about the energy mix, what we're referring to is for all of the energy we use across all sectors: transportation, electricity, residential, industrial, commercial. How much of that energy is supplied by each of these 9 sources? What percentage comes from oil, from coal, and so on? And so we asked people, what do you think the current energy mix is today? How much of each source do we use today? And then we said, what do you hope we use in 2050? What's the ideal energy mix you hope for in the future? We also asked for policy support for 12 energy policies. These were balanced between policies that are pro-decarbonization and 6 policies that are anti-decarbonization, so those that would be more supportive of fossil fuels, for instance, as well as ranking the importance of climate change. And so now we'll jump right into the results. And we'll go through this figure together. So the figure you're looking at here has 9 panels, 1 panel for each energy source we use in the United States. On the y-axis, you'll see percentage, and then on the x-axis, you'll see current and future. Right now, there's a black dot that indicates the amount of each energy source we used in 2018. So about 36% of our energy came from oil, 31% from natural gas, and so on. And these are arranged from what we use the most of to the least. Now what you're seeing is the estimates people have for how much of each energy source we use today. And this is broken down by political ideology. So what we see is participants are underestimating the amount of oil and natural gas that we use, and overestimating the amount of renewables that we use, particularly wind, solar, geothermal, and hydroelectricity, biomass being the exception, and a slight overestimation of the amount of coal. So the takeaway is participants think that our energy mix is more decarbonized than it actually is. And now we're seeing the future energy mix people want, right? So this line goes from where they think we are today to where they want to be in the future. And there's a few takeaway points that stand out. First, we see that people want a decarbonized energy future. We see a steep decrease in the use of fossil fuels. We see a sharp increase in the use of renewables, particularly wind and solar, and a slight decrease in the use of nuclear. What also stands out is that this trend is pretty consistent across ideological group. And while there are some slight differences, they're very small, right? So we have this kind of shared vision for this future energy mix that we want that's heavily decarbonized. And briefly, I'll present the policies. The main takeaway to get from these policies is that there's a divide between conservatives and liberals in the policies they support. So what we're looking at here are our 6 policies that would decarbonize our energy system, for example, a carbon tax or funding renewables. On the y-axis is opposition to support, And the takeaways here are that liberals tend to show stronger support for these policies than conservatives, with the exception of this policy right here, replacing coal with nuclear, where nuclear, again, wasn't as broadly supported as the other renewables. But the general trend is that liberals show stronger support. Similarly, we see the opposite on anti-decarbonization policies. So these are more beneficial to fossil fuels, so things like constructing oil pipelines or building new coal plants. And we see that liberals show more opposition than conservatives and moderates. Although one thing to note is that while there are these differences, we still see that conservatives generally, they're not supportive of these anti-decarbonization policies on average. Generally, they hover around neutral or slight opposition. So the key takeaway is that people really want a decarbonized energy future, but there is still this difference in the support for the policy pathways we need to achieve that energy future. And there were some limitations to this work. MTurk is a convenience sample, and our policies were pretty general and broad. And most importantly, and this relates to the study I'll be talking about next, this work can't explain what's actually driving this shared future energy mix people want, or explain where the differences in policy support are coming from. And that's what I'll be talking about next. So I'll move on to presenting work at the state level, and this work was more qualitative in nature, looking at energy mix perceptions in Indiana specifically. And so motivation for the policies people support generally varies by ideology and party. So in work looking at 16 reasons why people support renewable energy, they were given these reasons and asked to kind of rate their importance. Climate change was the most important for Democrats, whereas economic considerations were the most important for Republicans. Could also be attributed to differences in values. In a study looking at why people opted to install solar panels, for liberals, it was a sense of community and self-sufficiency, whereas for conservatives, it was largely just self-sufficiency driving their decision-making. And so there's evidence that a lot of factors play a role, but it may be dependent upon the resource and policy. And so it's important to note that a lot of the studies in previous work look at either one energy source or a handful of energy sources, whereas the work I'm going to present to you today, I tried to take a very comprehensive approach and look at all energy sources and get a variety of energy policies at the state and national level that both supported renewable energy and fossil fuels. And so the research questions driving this work, I wanted to use a survey and a semi-structured interview to understand what are people's perceptions of the current energy mix and what future energy mix do people hope for at the state level, particularly in Indiana, as it's a fossil fuel state. And most importantly, what are the factors driving the energy sources people want to use and the policies they support or oppose. So this gets at the question of why do we have this shared vision and where does the disagreement come from as far as policy support? And Indiana made for a good case study for a variety of reasons. As of 2018, Indiana ranked 8th in CO2 emissions per capita, 2nd in coal consumption just after Texas, so we're a heavily fossil fuel using state, and 7th in coal production. And renewables make up less than 7% of energy consumption in the state, and it's also majority Republican and conservative. And so I'll talk briefly about the methodology. So what you're seeing on the left is a map of Indiana. Every blue dot is a zip code in which I collected data for the present study. And so people were eligible if they've lived in Indiana for at least 3 years. And I interviewed 48 participants. I recruited these participants in public locations across the state, primarily libraries, but also shopping centers, public fairs, places like that. The data was collected the summer of 2019, pre-COVID, of course, and locations were selected based on political affiliation. So I used the 2016 election to identify blue counties. And for every blue county, I'd select 2 red counties nearby. And I tried to get a mix of urban and rural locations throughout the state. I've provided the demographics to get a sense of the sample, and there's a few things to note that stand out. First, the sample does skew older with a mean age of 52 years, so that's older than the state's average age. And it does skew lower income with a majority of the sample making less than $30,000 a year. And a majority of the sample has less than a college degree as well. Otherwise, it's majority conservative and Republican sample, which is the opposite of our national sample, and pretty evenly split on gender and the area that people were living in, urban, rural, and suburban. And so you see a similar table as to what we provided people in the first study I talked about. And so again, I used a paper survey and then conducted an interview. And so in the paper survey, we asked the same question, but for the state. So for the state of Indiana, what do you think is the current energy mix? And what do you hope the future energy mix looks like in 2050? So it's a replication, but for the state. And then of course, a variety of demographic questions as well. But the main component of this work is the semi-structured interview, in which we asked participants about their energy resource preferences. So after participants took this survey, I would provide them with a sheet of paper that would tell them the actual energy mix for the state of Indiana. So this is how much of each energy source we actually use within the state. And they were asked whether they would like to use more, less, or the same amount of each energy resource. They were also asked about 6 energy policies, 3 at the national level, 3 at the state level, whether they supported or opposed. And this is the crucial component. They were asked the why. So they were asked to explain what was driving their decision-making, what was driving their preferences and their support and opposition to policies. And I'll note that climate change questions were specifically left at the end of the survey or the interview. And this was as to not prime participants to be thinking about climate change as a concern, to see if it would come up organically throughout the interview. For analysis, interviews were transcribed verbatim, and they were coded. Thematic coding was used to identify the themes that were motivating people's responses. And these codes were developed through an iterative process with 2 coders. Basically, this was to see if the codes we had developed were accurately describing the themes that came out through the interviews. And generally, if you're going to use 1 person to code, if 2 people have agreement on roughly 20%, then you can use 1 coder for the rest of the interviews. And I'm happy to discuss what that process looks like more in depth in the Q&A if anybody has any questions. And we will jump right into the results. And so first, we looked at what are people's perceptions of the current and future energy mix for the state of Indiana. And what you see is a figure, much like the one we looked at earlier, but there's a few differences to note here. First, the order of the energy resources has changed. This because this is for the state of Indiana, and Indiana has a different energy mix than the national mix. So we see that we use more coal than any other energy resource. And you'll also see that this is political party, not ideology. A few participants struggled with the ideology question or chose not to answer. So we opted to analyze by party instead, which was more understandable to our participants. And what you'll notice here is we're seeing the same pattern that we did in our national study, where participants want to use more renewables, particularly wind and solar, and they want to use far less fossil fuel resources. So again, we see this steep decline. And what you'll notice is that we also see that this pattern is consistent across political party, much like the national study, and that participants are also nuclear averse here as well. And while the differences between Republicans and Democrats are bigger here than what we saw for our conservatives and liberals in our national study, this is a smaller study and in a more Republican fossil fuel dependent state. But the main takeaway is that we're seeing the same trend. Participants want a decarbonized energy future, and this is consistent across political party. So now we'll get at the why. What are the factors motivating why people want to use more or less of an energy resource? And we're going to fill out this figure off to the side together. It's color coded to try to help with interpretation. So generally those boxes in green are typically things that would decarbonize our energy system, and what's in red would hinder the decarbonization of our energy system. So the why. Why do participants want to use more fossil fuels? They generally perceived more fossil fuels to have positive economic impacts, right? They thought fossil fuels were a cheaper energy resource. It would help coal jobs and workers. This was particularly relevant for Indiana, as one of the communities I interviewed was next to a coal mine. And they also had this hierarchy of fossil fuels where natural gas was perceived to be much better than coal and oil, cleaner and less dirty, and that natural gas would help us achieve energy independence, specifically in regard to using less oil. So it was largely driven by economic reasons. But what about less? Why did participants want to use less fossil fuel resources? This was largely environmental and pollution concerns. People wanted to reduce pollution, reduce environmental harm, protect the air, protect public health, which all tie into one another. They also thought fossil fuels were expensive, specifically the extraction process, and also because these sources would run out, and as they ran out, they would only get more expensive. So it was economic reasons were playing a role here as well as protecting the environment. And what about low carbon resources? This is, we saw some natural groupings of renewable sources or low carbon sources emerge here as well. Solar and wind typically were grouped together a lot. They were talked about in the same way and compared quite frequently. Whereas hydro, geothermal, and biomass were in their own category. They weren't perceived as positively as solar and wind, and they were talked about in a less familiar way. And nuclear was separate entirely and considered much more risky. So we kind of had these natural groupings come out of our interviews. So why did people want more low carbon resources? Well, it was largely driven by this available, natural, free phenomenon, particularly with solar and wind, right? The resources are there. They're good for the environment, they're clean, and they're free. The sun is always shining. We always have wind. Why not use what we don't have to pay for? They also wanted to avoid waste, right? We have these sources. Why not put them to use? And anecdotes and experience were relied on, particularly for hydro, geothermal, and biomass. These were less familiar resources, And so people were largely relying on, oh, I know someone with geothermal, or I live near a hydro plant. So these became more important for those sources people knew less about. And of course, there were participants who wanted to use less low carbon resources. This was driven by a doubt that they were feasible or reliable. They were concerned that they might actually harm the environment or pollute, particularly biomass. And unfamiliarity, which may go to why we don't see as big of an increase for hydro and geothermal and biomass. These sources were perceived to be less familiar than solar and wind, and people would often report that they didn't know enough about those sources to really make a determination, or they were worried about using them because they didn't know as much about them. And fear and risk played a pretty big role for nuclear and to geothermal to some extent, right? People were pretty risk averse to nuclear and to a slight extent geothermal. So we filled out this figure here showing kind of not only what's driving support for these low carbon sources, but what's driving support for fossil fuels as well. And we're seeing that environmental reasons and economic reasons are playing a pretty big role, but we haven't seen climate change pop up just yet. Finally, we're going to move on to policy. And we're going to talk about what's driving why people support and oppose the policies. So we have two that are pro-fossil fuel policies. These are building more coal plants at the state level and relaxing oil and natural gas regulations at the national level. So those are our two pro-fossil fuel policies. Now our pro-low carbon policies, at the state level, we have net metering. So this is kind of people who install solar panels, getting paid for the energy they return to the grid, and a renewable portfolio standard, which generally is applying an amount of renewable energy or an amount of electricity that has to come from renewables. And then at the national level, we have a carbon fee or a carbon tax and the Green New Deal. So we'll start with those two fossil fuel policies. Why do people support these? Again, it goes back to economic reasons, right? Coal workers and coal jobs. People think coal is cheap, and thus it's good for the economy. It'll help the local economy if we use more coal. And so why did people oppose? Well, for similar reasons as they opposed the energy resources, right? They were worried about the environment, the air, people's health. They were also risk averse to accidents or the process of extracting these resources. So it was largely driven around risk and concerns about the environment and public health. But what about our low carbon policies, those four that would promote the use of low carbon resources? People supported these largely because they support renewables. Renewables are free or low cost. We want to use more of them, so we support these policies. We want to protect the environment. And on the flip side of the coin, they thought it would lead to positive economic impacts as well if we used renewables. We also see a new theme pop up of fairness, right? People who pollute should be held accountable, and people who are making good choices to protect the environment should be rewarded, particularly around net metering. And climate change came up here, but I have a star next to this. Climate change primarily came up in discussions of the Green New Deal. And climate change was specifically mentioned in the question about the Green New Deal. So participants could have been primed to be thinking about climate change because it was in the question. But we start to see climate change pop up here as a reason to support low carbon policies. And of course, we have opposition. Why are people opposing these policies? They perceive them to have negative economic impacts. It's either going to raise my taxes or it's going to hurt the economy. These policies are expensive. They're too extreme, particularly with the Green New Deal. There was the perception that it was doing too much. And that some of these policies would be unfair to the public, particularly a carbon fee, right? Even if that carbon fee is put on utilities, it'll come back to me somehow, was the general consensus from participants. And they were also worried about who is benefiting and who is paying for these policies, right? They were worried that the government and utilities were corrupt and businesses were corrupt, and vested business interests would just cause these policies not to work out. And so we have kind of mapped out what's driving support for decarbonization and support or opposition to decarbonization. And the reasons are largely economic or environmental. And we see climate change isn't kind of the most salient concern to participants here. There were some limitations. This was a convenient sample, of course, of people who opted into the study. It's not representative of the Indiana population as a whole. And of course, with an interview, there are interviewer and social desirability effects where simply having to answer in this face-to-face format would have changed their responses. So now I'll go into a more broad discussion of what these findings mean together. And so the key takeaways, again, are that a majority of the people in these studies wanted more low carbon energy, and we see this at the national and state level for a state that uses a lot of fossil fuels and is very conservative and Republican. And we see this desire for a decarbonized energy mix across party and ideology. We also see that a majority of our participants do support policy pathways to get there, but we're still seeing that Democrats and liberals are showing far greater support than Republicans and conservatives, and to a lesser extent, independents and moderates. So we still see this bigger partisan divide in how we actually reach this energy future. And as to the why, in the Indiana sample, climate change is not the most salient motivation. And instead, we see that motivations are resource and policy dependent, right? We have those hierarchies and natural groupings that came out. And these motivations are largely economic and environmental. People are worried about health and safety, right? Risk perceptions. And also familiarity and experience with some of these resources, particularly those lesser known sources like hydro and geothermal. And fairness and accountability, right? The idea that who's benefiting from some of these policies and energy sources, who's going to pay for these, right? And is it fair, right? Are polluters being held accountable? And so I think this leaves open a lot of areas of future work, right? We can investigate perceptions in other locations that have very different energy mixes than Indiana, right? Such as places where renewables are used more broadly, or different sorts of fossil fuels, or states that are experiencing more salient or more very serious climate change impacts. So for instance, places where there's sea level rise or wildfires or extreme droughts, particularly studying those states, maybe climate change is a more salient concern for those communities. We can also explore how motivations for less familiar sources or less familiar technologies change over time. Might be interesting to see as we start to see new technologies, how can we get these grouped in and get the same positive view that solar and wind enjoy. We could also look at how people make trade-offs between these motivating factors, right? We see climate change is very important in these closed-ended quantitative surveys, but how are people making these trade-offs between all of the factors that matter to them for these different energy sources? And finally, we can try to increase support and salience for decarbonization and the policies we need for decarbonization and individual actions by both working within the motivations people have for decarbonization, as well as challenging the perceptions that are driving fossil fuel support. And so with that, I will thank everyone for their time and for listening, and I am happy to answer any questions.
Terrific. Deidra, thank you so much for walking us through that. That was a really interesting study. I don't know if you realized, so last week for our other new energy talk, we had Tricia Shrum from the University of Mont, who was looking at intrinsic motivations. And so following up her study on intrinsic motivations, how stable are they? Are there ways that those might be modified, with the impact of a perception or a feeling of warm glow from doing certain activities? That was an interesting precursor to now your study, looking at, how folks' perceptions of the fuel mix are at play for us. And so I would like to invite all of our listeners to please go ahead and throw in any questions you have for Deidra in the Q&A. And I guess what I'd like to start off with is just asking, sort of on a broad base, were you surprised by any of the results that you found in the study? Were there any aspects of the findings that you developed from either part, either the survey or the interviews, that you found particularly of note?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think a few things were surprising. One, I thought climate change would be more salient than it was, maybe not the most important issue, but it really didn't come up frequently at all. When it did, it was primarily referenced by Democrats. I think only one Republican in the sample mentioned climate change as a driving factor. I was also surprised that even though there's these partisan disagreement about climate change and the policies that people support, there really is this kind of bipartisan agreement on this clean energy future, relying on low carbon sources. And lastly, when looking at political differences for the reasons people are supporting decarbonization or supporting fossil fuel resources, there's not a lot of partisan division in those motivating factors. There's slightly more Republicans reference economic reasons, more Democrats environmental, but there was largely agreement in why people were supporting decarbonization. So more agreement than disagreement, which isn't necessarily a bad thing.
No, absolutely. I think that one of the things that we have often seen, right, is that, as you designed your study, right, you didn't activate the question about climate right at the start, right? And because often we've seen that climate is a more polarizing term than, for example, energy is, right? And so to a certain degree, that's played out here. Although it's really interesting to me, I wonder, to what degree, right, are people reacting regarding their perceptions of policy, because either how policy is represented in the news sources that they consume, or how it was represented when you ask the questions in the study, right? And so I don't know if you can give us a little bit more detail about how you framed, it's one thing to sort of frame the energy resources, right, in one way, and you encountered certainly some lack of familiarity, but some sense of familiarity among others, right? But in the case of posing your questions about the policies, right, did you use basically the phrases that you showed us? Did you use, an official name of a policy? Did you describe a policy? What happened when people said, well, I don't know about that policy, or what do you mean by a carbon fee or a carbon tax, right? So if you could give us a little bit more detail on that, that might illuminate that question.
No, that's a fantastic question. I appreciate you asking it, because it was something I forgot to mention. When I asked people about policies in the interview, I did explain the policies in not great depth, but quite a bit of detail. And the benefit of an interview is that when participants didn't necessarily understand a policy, they could point that out to me, which is great. But yes, so participants were given the policy in a way that described it. So it wasn't just, do you support or oppose a carbon fee? It was, here's what a carbon fee would do. Do you support or oppose it? And I would ask follow-up questions for the more complex policies, such as the carbon fee or net metering, that would say, okay, here's what the policy is. Do you support or oppose that? Now, what if we change this one small aspect, right? Like the carbon fee. What if that carbon fee was only on utilities? Then would it change your answer?
Yeah,
Or
yeah.
for the renewable portfolio standard, it was like, do you support the idea? What about a renewable portfolio standard of 20%? Would you support or oppose? So yes, that could also be why there was less of a partisan division in the interviews for the policies I asked about, because it was asked about in a way that wouldn't kind of prime these ideological cues.
Okay.
Yeah.
I have follow-ups to that, but in the meantime, let me pose a question that was shared in the Q&A. So folks, I saw somebody raised their hand, but if you could actually put your question into the Q&A, then I can actually make sure that we get your question into the mix. So Greg Sparkman asks, if there's a way, do you think that there's a way, especially among conservatives, to erode the zero-sum beliefs about environmental benefit and economic outcome? So I guess that Greg is saying there's this sense that it's an either or, right, between environment and jobs, right? We've heard that for decades now. And did your study or does your previous work give us any suggestions for how we can undermine that perception?
Yeah, that's a great question. It wasn't a prominent theme in my interviews, but I did notice some participants were doing exactly that. They were pitting the environment and the economy against one another. I think there's been framing work looking at kind of framing things in light of environmental versus economic benefits. And I think one of the issues with frames is the frame can be changed. I don't know whether there's a way to kind of erode these beliefs, but I can think of ways we could test that, which would be really interesting, which I know doesn't answer your question, Greg, but I think it would be interesting to kind of manipulate the kind of environmental and economic benefits of these various policies, or kind of have these interventions that either align with environmental beliefs or economic beliefs, or challenge some of those beliefs, and see whether that can increase support, which someone may have done and already, which would be interesting to see. But I think there would be a way to do this, and qualitative studies like this are a great way to start developing those, because we can see what's motivating, what energy sources people want in the policies they support, and we can try to challenge this idea that it's environment versus economy, kind of say it doesn't have to be one or the other, it can be both.
Okay. Another question that I have is with regard to the particular pro and anti-decarbonization policies that you chose. How did you choose those particular policies to flag, both at the national and at the state level, as opposed to other policies?
That's a great question. The policies that we chose were kind of through an iterative process of what was, so for the national study, it was policies that had been asked about in other work, and policies that would have kind of a bigger impact on decarbonizing the energy system, and then kind of narrowing it down based on policies that were understandable to our participants through pre-testing and play testing. With the Indiana study, with those 6 policies, it was policies that were actually either implemented in the state or being discussed in the state. So particularly net metering, and Indiana has a renewable portfolio standard that's a goal, not a set standard. And we chose, oh, and we also tried to get coverage of all our energy sources. That was the other factor motivating the policies we selected. So we wanted policies that covered fossil fuels and low carbon sources and nuclear. So we were trying to get policies that had broad coverage of all those sources.
Got it. Thank you. Another question from Judith Cola. Judith says, found this to be a very interesting and illuminating talk. Thank you. Wondering if you think that state results would be quite different for states in which fossil fuels are imported, such as New Hampshire, where Dartmouth is located, right? And also a follow-on, is solar and wind growing in Indiana? And is it increasingly perceived as an opportunity for new jobs and economic growth, or maybe not?
Great questions. I will tackle those one at a time. I think the results would be quite different for based on a state's energy mix. Whether or not it's imported, I'm not sure. That would actually be an interesting question, because for Indiana, again, coal is we're a coal production state, right? So it was pretty salient to participants, but I think where fossil fuels are imported, it might be different. If participants are aware, they may not have the awareness or knowledge that it's imported or what that even means. But I think if they knew that their state wasn't benefiting and instead was paying for fossil fuels, they would probably want to be rid of. My hypothesis would be they would dislike or oppose them more. And for solar and wind in Indiana, we use more wind than solar. If it's growing at a slow rate. And I don't know that participants perceived it as opportunities for new jobs and economic growth. They thought it would have positive economic impacts, but that was kind of this general sense that they got. They didn't specifically say, I think more wind energy will create more wind jobs, or I think more solar will create more solar jobs. It was more a broad sense that renewables are good for the economy. I like renewables. But I think that would be a great opportunity for another study, is kind of presenting renewables as more positive for the economy, especially with the participants who care far more about those economic reasons, and seeing how that changes their level of support.
Great, thank you. Jonathan Winder asks, could you please expand on the extent to which conservatives' antipathy to decarbonization is driven by suspicion of government mandates? So I guess to see where this might have come up in your interviews. To what extent does the weak support among conservatives for or antipathy to decarbonization flip when it's the private sector as opposed to the government who's pushing renewables?
That is a great question. I don't know if I can directly answer it based off of my data, but I will say, because I asked about government policy specifically, not whether or not the private sector was pushing for renewables, but I think that would be an interesting question to include, right? Which groups do people want to see pushing for this change? I will say that in discussions with interviewees, there was distrust not only of government, but also utility industries and business. So that was a theme that emerged. People thought it was kind of unfair that these industries were getting to pollute and not paying for it. And they thought it was kind of unfair that those industries could just put it back on individuals by charging them more. Or a common theme with the carbon fee was, if you just put the tax on the utility, they're just going to raise my prices. So I think it would depend on the private sector doing the action as to whether or not people are more supportive. And again, this isn't a representative sample by any means, but whether or not that individual has a positive or negative view of big corporations as well. My sense is that in my study, at least, there was distrust both among the government and among big business. Yeah.
So I guess a closing question for you, or one of our closing questions, right? Still able to take them in the Q&A if you have them, but what guidance would you have for folks who are seeking to develop policies, right? Or incentivization structures, maybe, right? So maybe not just government policies, but incentivization structures for business, right? What suggestions would you have for us that can leverage what you found in terms of the shared, the shared vision, right? If we're all looking for a shared vision where we have fewer fossil fuels and more renewables, right? But the policies that are sort of on the table right now just aren't cutting it, right? In terms of getting that shared sense of direction. How might we adjust, right, our strategies from that, from either a government or a business or a local civic, right, perspective? Any thoughts there?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that's why, I think doing these types of studies in a variety of areas is great, because it's kind of giving you the snapshot of the factors that are most important to the people you're trying to reach. So I think I made the figure, the color-coded figure, that's actually a very watered down version of a more complex figure that has a lot more of the themes. These weren't the only themes that emerged, but it's kind of like a roadmap for saying what's important to people, and that's how we can connect with them when we're developing these policies, whether a government policy or a business policy, and the goals that we want people to be on board with. So it's aligning those policies and communicating them in a way that aligns with what people value. There's a roadmap for that here. And so, for example, it may not be climate. If you're in Indiana and you want to get renewable energy, saying it'll help with climate change may not be the way to go. I would love for that to, be a main motivating factor, but it might be, hey, this is not going to cost a lot and it's going to protect the environment, and here's how it will create jobs, right?
Right.
You can kind of tailor the message. Yeah, so I think it provides a way to connect with people, and also gets at being able to not just connect on these values broadly, but being able to say this is what the local communities are concerned about, and being able to connect more locally, given that some work suggests that people care far more about what's happening in their local area.
Thank you. I guess an implicit question there is, are you planning any follow-up studies in other states, right, or other regions to replicate this methodology?
Not at the present time. I think that would be great to do in the future, or I would definitely encourage other people who have very interesting state mixes to do that same thing, because I would love to see what it looks like in different states with very different energy mixes.
Absolutely. Super. Okay, so Randy Spidell, you do have the last word as our last question. So Randy asks, in asking about policies, was timing ever an explained factor to be considered? Your data seems to show that many people of diverse backgrounds recognize there are issues with carbon content of energy and that the issues need to be addressed. However, in your interviews, did you try to get a handle on the breakdown of which background of people believes we need to do this now, right, next month, versus those who think it can be postponed because the issues are important, but they're not urgent? So if you could give a soundbite answer to that question from Randy, that would be great.
Yeah, so I did not ask about specific time constraints. In retrospect, I wish I would have put some sort of timeline for when you want to see these actions into that study. Right. But no, they were left pretty open-ended. Just here's the only timeline that was provided was that future energy mix of 2050, right? The policies, weren't given a specific time constraint. I will say one theme that emerged was extremity. So people didn't want to see too extreme action too fast, which maybe not the answer we want to hear. But no, it was generally left pretty broad, and participants were left to imagine their own timelines.
I think that's a great question, though, because I think that bringing into that factor, right, of urgency, right, and where does that factor in for the respondents? I appreciate that, Randy, for bringing in that level of thinking for our plans for decarbonizing. It matters when, right, and how fast and how hard we need to move to get to those. So thank you very much for the questions today. Deidra, I want to thank you very much for participating today in our new energy series. Fascinating work. I think that you are one to watch. So all the best to you as you work on completing your PhD, and we'll look forward to seeing what studies come out of your career next. So thank you again.
Thank you for having me. This is a great series.